Hello world, you're listening to STRATEGIKON, the podcast of Sage International Australia, or SIA, your window to all things security and foreign affairs. To say the Russian Revolution was purely a thing that originated through Russian poverty, the political incompetence of Tsar Nicholas II, and the country's almost hopeless involvement in World War I would be a gross oversimplification. While it is true that the origins of organized Russian anger against the Romanov monarchy went back as far as 1905, the 1917 revolution's touchstone figure, Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, otherwise known by his alias Lenin, was a political exile living in Switzerland at the time of the first major internal upheaval in Russia in February 1917. Lenin was not a passive bystander as an exile. Soviet history has it that he was deeply concerned for the plight of his people and for his revolutionary political fellow travelers, and after his involvement in the failed 1905 revolution, Lenin spent a good deal of his time traveling throughout Europe, building networks with other communist ideologues. But ultimately, it was the German High Command's decision in 1917, after the February Revolution, which saw the rise of the Petrograd Soviet in St. Petersburg, and the end of the Tsar's reign, to allow safe passage to Lenin on a train from Switzerland through to Russia that gave the Russian revolutionary masses their messiah. For the Germans, desperate to win World War I, the more chaos in Russia, the more likely it would end its war with the Central Powers. In an interesting counterfactual, had the Germans prevented Lenin from entering Russia, would the Bolsheviks have been strong enough to sustain themselves and their cause without Lenin's leadership and fiery rhetoric to guide them? We will never know. Nonetheless, with Lenin's simple and effective slogan of peace, bread and land, he managed to bring much of the disgruntled Imperial Russian army into his Bolshevik cadres, giving him the force he needed to launch his coup against the Russian provincial government in October 1917, an incoherent mix of traditional aristocratic, capitalist and moderate socialist interests headed by Alexander Kerensky. On the 3rd of March 1918, Lenin managed to end the war with Germany and Austria-Hungary at the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, temporarily ceding vast tracts of land to the Central Powers. Lenin's victory over the provisional government led to civil war between November 1917 to October 1922, political purges against perceived enemies of the Soviet Russian state, both within the Communist Party and external to the party, and of course to dictatorship. As the Communist Party matured and consolidated its power throughout Russia, it became one of the modern world's most oppressive regimes. And yet for all the horrors it inflicted upon its own people, the Communists managed to jumpstart Russia, a country that was, to all intents and purposes, a failed state, with an underdeveloped agrarian economy in 1917, to the second most powerful country in the world by 1945. Millions perished as a consequence of communist management to Russian superpower status. The question we ask today is, was this sacrifice worth it? Did the millions who died during the enforced famines, or as press-ganged laborers and soldiers, or who were transported to the gulags of Siberia as enemies of the state, worth the development of modern Russia? 100 years on, what can we say about the Russian Revolution and its impact on the development of Russia? What can we say about how the mythology of the Soviet state drives President Vladimir Putin along his own political path? Today, Dr. Jonathan Z. Ludwig, our resident Russian expert and observer of American politics, is back to help us explore this deeply tragic and sometimes triumphant legacy of the Russian October Revolution of 1917. Welcome back, Jonathan.
It's good to be back, John. How are you today?
Very good indeed. Jonathan, what can you say about the rule of Tsar Nicholas II? Why was he and his ministers so out of touch with the Russian people? Did he and his family really deserve their fate?
Nicholas II gets a lot of the blame for the events of 1917. Some of it's fair, a lot of it isn't fair. He starts off with a lot of major disadvantages, right? He inherited a throne that was run by the Romanovs for about 300 years by the time he got there. And from the time of Peter the Great ruled until 1725 or so. From the time of Peter the Great until the end of the Romanov line, the Russian court largely did not operate as a Russian court. It tended to operate as a French court or a German court, so that by the time the 1800s rolled around, by the time you got to the Alexanders, the defeat of Napoleon in 1812, there were really two Russias. There was a Russia of the court that operated in, again, French or German. Some of these czars did not know Russian very well. Nicholas and Alexandra, in fact, were famous for communicating with each other and writing in English. And you had the Russia of the people, and the Russia of the people, of course, spoke Russian. You had some of the famous authors of the 19th century, such as Alexander Griboyedov, who put voices into his characters, really just decrying the fact that there had been this split between the ruling class and the peasantry. Even going back further than that, Russia never had feudalism, so you had no really depth and breadth of the way that the country was structured. This means that the entire country was dependent upon having a strong, successful czar. If you had a weak czar, if you had a czar who encountered crises, there was no middle level to sort of keep things together, as we saw in places elsewhere in Europe. If something happened to the leader, they could keep the country together. Nicholas never really wanted to become czar. Other people thought his brother Constantine was better suited for the throne. Constantine was younger, by law couldn't take it over. You also had the problem, ever since Alexander I became czar, by basically getting rid of his father, giving tacit approval that his father be removed in a rather bloody way, that czars did not train their children to become czars out of fear that they would then see themselves prepared and step in. Alexander III, Nicholas II's father, was a very brutal czar. He witnessed his father, Alexander II, being blown up. One of the many bad things that Russia has given to this world is terrorism, anarchism, etc., where killing leaders, is a way of life. Alexander III saw that this compromise with the liberal elements ended up in the death of his father. He was going to be a much more reactionary czar. This is a lesson that Nicholas learned as well, that if you compromise, it's not going to end well. This meant in 1905, and there was a revolution in 1905 that I don't think we celebrated 12 years ago or really recognized 12 years ago. But, basically you had people coming to the capital making demands that, some of us would see as being very reasonable today. Lower taxes, more land, 8-hour working days, the right to unionize, rights for ethnic minorities. Notably, these didn't happen under communism either, but we'll get to that in a little while. But the point is, if Nicholas II had met even some of these demands, it probably would have been enough for the people to go home and say, okay, we've gotten something, we'll work at it. World War I did not work in Nicholas's favor. He had a wife who was German, a prime minister in 1916 by the name Boris Stürmer, who had a German name. And when the battles did not go well, they took the blame for it, right? The Russians thought there must be a spy in court, somebody who is, arguing the German side, hurting the Russian side. So you went to the people who were German and blamed them. Alexander did not speak good Russian. This did not hold her in good stead with the Russian people either. As all this started to blow up, Nicholas wanted to abdicate to his son. His only son was a hemophiliac, not in good shape to take over his throne. He was going to have his younger brother, Nicholas's younger brother, Michael, be regent. Michael didn't want the job. As czar. Essentially, Nicholas simply abdicated. The provisional government took over. You basically have a situation also. Russia was looking weaker and weaker to its own people as time went on, right? Russia was on the winning side against Napoleon with Alexander I marching all the way to Paris. Ever since the Crimean War, Russia had really been on a losing trend. And, people begin to wonder, how can such a great power lose over and over and over again? And if Russia is becoming, sort of a loser in world affairs, how can a country like that protect its own people? With all that being said, however, Nicholas probably deserved to lose the throne, although there were plenty of opportunities to save the monarchy. There are ways he could have done that. A few changes in history, Lenin would have never taken over. But with all that being said, they certainly didn't deserve to be shot, under Lenin's orders, by the way, as they were.
Can you say something about the relationship between the Tsar and his court, or more generally the aristocracy, which, from my reading of Russian history, was a very interesting set of political allies for the Tsar. Sometimes they would fall in behind the Tsar's leadership, other times they'd be, busily conspiring. What can you say about the court of Nicholas the Second?
Well, as with most courts, there's always courtly intrigue going around. Rasputin was a player in all of this, right? Rasputin, the holy man, self-proclaimed holy man from Russia, who it was thought by Alexander was the only one who could cure their son's hemophilia. There were people who lined up behind Rasputin. There were others who saw him probably legitimately as a threat to the throne. Why is Nicholas listening, to this madman, from Siberia rather than us? You also had the problem of, he had a parliament, he had a Duma to deal with. And, he had a man by the name of Alexander Kerensky, who was one of the leaders of the Duma. And Kerensky is somebody who did not see the Germans as being the enemy. He saw the Tsars and the Tsarist bureaucracy as being the enemy. So you didn't even have sort of the two ruling branches. It's still an absolute monarchy. But, a smart Tsar, like the smart Tsars did in times of old through the Boyar Council, other places, would still run things through the Duma to give them legitimacy. You had people like Kerensky who just didn't want to play the same game.
With the end of the Tsar's rule in February 1917, what made the Petrograd Soviet so competitive against the provisional government? Was it all about Kerensky's weakness as a leader? The high ambitions of the Petrograd Soviet? Was there no way the two groups could have compromised and merged into a unified Russian government? If not, why not?
I don't think there was much hope for the two groups to compromise because they both wanted power. Kerensky was the legitimate leader initially, but the deal was the provisional government was supposed to then call elections for the Constituent Assembly. That was not done until after November of 1917, not until after Lenin came to power. And, for people who wonder about, one time, one election, and then dictatorship shows up, this is something that's talked about in the Middle East and other parts of the world. That's actually what happened in Russia. I can come back that a little bit. Let me come back that a little bit in a second. Kerensky, as I just said, part of Kerensky's problem was he saw the Tsar being an enemy rather than the Tsar being an ally. He saw the Tsarist bureaucracy being an enemy rather than ally. He saw enemies within rather than enemies without. So in this way, Kerensky and the Duma never tried to be a loyal opposition, right? We talk about British Parliament. I'm sure the Australian Parliament is designed to be the same way, right? It's the opposition, but it's the loyal opposition, right? You debate over ideas, but you don't debate over, whether you're right or your enemy is right. This then set up a pattern where there was no need for an opposition to be a loyal opposition, right? The Petrograd Soviet could stand up against the provisional government. It could make some honest claims, such as there was supposed to be an election. Why haven't these people, why haven't they held the elections as promised? But they probably also thought even if there were an election, their parties would not hold a majority. If you're in that position, much as Lenin would be, you can afford to be much more radical. You can afford to not step up and try to compromise. In other words, you can stand on your so-called principles on the theory that you're never going to be able to rule anyway. So why do you need to get along with anyone?
What did the Germans expect to happen once they backed Lenin's return to Russia in April 1917? Were they completely ignorant of the possible long-term effects a Bolshevik-led Russia would pose to Germany's long-term security?
I don't think they were ignorant of the effects. I just didn't think they thought a lot of them would ever come to play. Germany assumed, I imagine, right up until the very end of the war that they were going to win. Therefore, whatever happened in Russia was not going to affect them, as a nation that lost the war. I believe they knew exactly what they were doing by sending Lenin back to Russia. They simply hoped that it would help their war effort, that Lenin would basically cause enough trouble, discombobulate the Tsar, throw things out of whack enough, influence events enough that Kerensky would have to get out of the war, so they could stabilize things, things inside the country. My guess is an ideal Germany would probably hope that Lenin would instigate things enough, they would drop out of the war, and then they would shoot Lenin, end of story. They certainly knew what Lenin was about, right? They had Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, two Germans who were in prison at the time, socialist revolutionaries in Germany, pushing for a violent revolution if necessary, within Germany. So that they had their own concerns, what could happen inside their country. They probably didn't want Lenin in the area. He was in Switzerland, afraid maybe he could, foment some events over the borders. But my guess is they simply wanted out of the region in Russia to stir up trouble there. The evidence for this is largely that, the Germans were financing Lenin even basically until the end of the war in 1918. This did cause Lenin some problems when it was discovered right before he took over in November. He actually had to leave Russia after his return for a little while because he was rightly seen as a traitor, accepting money from the enemy to come in and destabilize the country.
It's really interesting that you should say that, because you kind of think to yourself, even though he did promise to bring peace to Russia, get Russia out of the war, there must have been a segment of the Russian leadership that saw Lenin in that light, that he is committing treason by dealing with the enemy.
It is, but Lenin also laid very low back in Russia, right? He wore disguises. He didn't go out very much. Some people after the fact were saying that as the events of November, October in Russia at the time approached closer and closer, Trotsky was the one out on the barricades, rallying the people. Lenin was a coward hiding away in the shadows until it was safe to come out. There were a couple of near misses, a couple of times that Tsarist forces, had him in their sights. He was just in disguise. They didn't know it was him. These are all these little missed instances. If an assassin's bullet had hit Lenin, a little bit more to the side, if the Tsarist forces would have recognized him, if he would have gone down this road into the roadblock instead of another, we wouldn't have had all of this.
It's interesting, but Lenin's top choice for revolution in Europe was not obviously Mother Russia. It was the more industrialized areas of Europe, namely Germany, Great Britain, maybe even
because
France
that's
at the
what Marx
outside.
argued as well, right? Marx never thought it could happen in a place. Russia was too backwards.
So did Germany actually do itself a favor by exporting this Bolshevik revolutionary outside of Western Europe and back into agrarian Russia, thinking that the revolution would, by its very nature, fail because obviously Russia was an agrarian economy with very little industry?
I mean, that may have been part, that may have been part of the hopes that, if he wasn't successful, it might just fizzle out. Unfortunately for them, it was successful. You then have the rise of the right in Germany that rises in reaction to a communist Russia. So, so in some ways, them sending him back, this is like, the domino effect they talked about, in the 60s and 70s under communism, right? It's like one little thing changes. An argument can be made that if the revolution wasn't successful, Lenin hadn't come to power, there might not have ever been a Hitler either.
Okay, so with regard to the overthrow of the provisional government, what was this orchestrated by the Russian people as a popular rebellion, or was it a coup launched by Lenin's Bolsheviks?
It became a popular rebellion in the 1960s. And let me explain what I mean by that, okay? Lenin, by his own admission, detested the masses, right? The left always talks about speaking for the people, for the masses. Lenin detested the masses. He detested Russia. He detested Russians. In large part, this is why he could be so destructive to his own country. He didn't care what happened to these people, right? As we just mentioned, Germany and Great Britain were key for his revolution, not Russia. He didn't have faith in the Russian people. Interestingly, everyone else on the left, not the Bolsheviks, the Mensheviks, other socialist revolutionary groups, did have faith in the Russian people. So if you'd had pretty much any other sort of leftist group taking over, again, history might have turned out differently, certainly a lot less destructive. Lenin, of course, doesn't live forever. Lenin dies, I believe, 1924. After a power struggle, Stalin takes over. Stalin was not an intimate friend of Lenin. Stalin was not intimately involved, with all of these events. But Stalin had to promote himself. If you look at propaganda posters after Stalin took over, suddenly you've gone from pictures of Lenin to pictures of Lenin with Stalin next to him, right? It no longer behooves Stalin for the myth to continue that this was all Lenin, right? So now it's not. Now it can't be Lenin and Stalin either. Nobody would buy that. But he suddenly says it was a party victory, right? In other words, it was now the Bolshevik party. It wasn't Lenin. Stalin dies. Nikita Khrushchev takes over, this is where it becomes a mass movement, right? We can't just go back to it being Lenin. That would be negating the role of the party. But who's the party supposed to speak for, right? The Communist Party, the Bolsheviks Party is supposed to speak for the masses. So now Khrushchev, promotes this revisionist history, which is taken up by scholars in the West to say that, it really was a popular rebellion. It was accomplished by the masses. Now, if this was only being said in the Soviet Union, nobody would have cared, right? People took, Soviet history with a grain of salt. But the problem is, the 60s, the 70s, this is where you have revisionist scholarship taking hold in the West, really for two reasons, right? You had a new group of scholars coming up who, without access to Soviet archives, without access to material, really don't have anything new to write. So what do? They start going after the previous generation, eminent scholars like Richard Pipes, who served on President Reagan's National Security Council, who headed the Team B analysis of the Soviet capabilities, right? He was attacked by, somebody who never became as good of a, historian, as reputable as a scholar as he did. Simply, this person wanted to make a name. You do that by attacking the previous generation, saying, they were all wrong about these things. But it's also, what did the Soviets do, right? The people who write the good history, the people who write what they want to have written, get access to certain archives, right? Get certain privileges. So, they're basically writing, to further their careers, even if it isn't always the truth. And of course, now we see several decades later, people still call this the Russian Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, but then because that makes a good headline. But if you read into the article, pretty much all the scholars are agreed upon, it was a coup. They seized power overnight. What's the best evidence that it was never a people's movement? Political parties in the West, right? They count party roles, right? The Conservatives and Labour in the UK, Republicans and Democrats here, right? Liberals and Labour there. You want to brag about how many people have signed up as party members, right? Whether they vote that way all the time or not, whether they show up for every election, if you hold a 2-to-1 advantage over your opponents, everyone wants to jump on the winning bandwagon. Even until the end of communist times, right? It was very elitist to become a member of the Communist Party, the Bolshevik Party. Not just anybody could show up and say, hey, I want to join the Communist Party, the way you can go to your county office here and register as a Republican or a Democrat. You can switch your registration. Nobody cares. There are litmus tests. You have to have sponsors. You have to show that you really understand or in favor of it, right? If this were a true mass movement, you would make it open for anybody to join the party, and they didn't do that.
It's really quite amazing because, so much of the literature with regard to communism is all about equality. And, of course, having now just unpacked all of that, it had nothing to do about equality. It was all about elitism all along.
Well, the other thing was, if Lenin was truly interested in equality, if Lenin was truly interested in some mass movement or some sort of democratic movement, he could have joined the provisional government, right? After November of 1917, there was an election to the Constituent Assembly, right? The equivalent of the Mensheviks got the majority of the votes. Lenin's party, the Bolsheviks, got less than 24%. What did he do? He abolished it. If he really cared about what the people wanted, he would have run with the Constituent Assembly. He would have been a minority party. He would have let somebody else run the country, and he would have tried to make his political case.
Bolsheviks would have been much more legitimate, I suppose, in a political context, yeah?
Well, let's also remember, right, what does the name Bolshevik mean? Right, Bolshevik from Bolshe meaning bigger, Menshevik from Menshe meaning lesser or smaller, right? Even the names are a lie, right? The Mensheviks had the larger party membership, but let's say, you're a semi-literate, Russian peasant, Russian worker, you can't read, but you know Russian, and you hear these people saying the Bolshevik Party, since you know Russian, you assume that it's the majority, you assume it has a mass following, right? Lenin was good at propaganda. He was horrible about everything else, but he was good about propaganda. But Lenin himself said, what? A lie repeated often enough becomes indistinguishable from the truth.
So did Lenin deliver on his promise to the long-suffering Russian people of peace, bread, and land once the Bolsheviks were in power?
The short answer is yes, no, and sort of temporarily.
That's a complicated answer.
But you asked me about three things, so I gave you three answers, right? Okay.
Thank you.
So peace, yes, right? He signs a separate peace with Germany in 1918. He gave up parts of the land in the Baltics, in Poland and Ukraine to Germany in exchange for peace. However, for him, this was a meaningless gesture. He assumed that world revolution was going to spring up in Germany and England everywhere around the world. He was also arrogant enough to think that he would be the one in charge of this new world. So it didn't matter if he gave it away because he would just give it back. This is the first sign, if you knew Lenin, if you followed Lenin at the time, that he was willing to lie, to give up anything as a promise to get what he wanted, then he would just take it back. Land was another example of this. The peasants, ever since early 1917, February of 1917, which, by the way, was a real revolution, had been seizing land from landowners, dividing it up among themselves. All Lenin sort of did was bless them, say, yes, it's okay, you can keep it. However, of course, he had planned the second he could get away with it to grab it back and nationalize it, right? The same way that it was later done, under Stalin, collective farming and things like that. So that's why I said yes on peace, temporarily on land, no on bread. Lenin, being a Marxist-Leninist, was really completely clueless in economics, right? The provisional government wasn't much better, right? The provisional government had imposed a ceiling on food prices, which caused shortages of food in the cities. Peasants didn't want to sell the grains at a loss. So basically the peasants were angry for having to sell their grain for nothing. The workers were angry because inflation and prices made it almost impossible to buy food. Lenin came in and instead of undoing this, simply intensified the brutality of the enforcement of price controls. Is what happens then, rather than starve in the cities, people simply went back to the countryside. So, you basically had, mass voluntary emigration outside of the city, hoping they could get closer to the land. In the end, though, many of them still died of starvation.
Which is really weird, because in the West, you had a migration from the country into the city to buy a part of that sort of whole modern lifestyle. And in Russia, you had a migration from the city into the country so they could feed themselves, essentially.
Right, but if you were originally, right, as the 800s wound to an end, you had more and more people, as Russia became industrialized, pouring from the country into the cities. This was simply thinking that if the problem is the peasants can't get the grain to the cities, let's go to where the grain is. But then at some point, of course, there were problems. One of the other problems Nicholas faced was, a small famine. Crops didn't work well for there was a whole effect. But basically, by 1920, 1921, the Bolshevik state was falling apart. Right, there was massive unrest, rebellion, basically brewing against the increasingly brutal Leninist state. So what does Lenin do? He lies again. He gets up and says, I never intended for things to be this way. This was war communism. Basically, we have this civil war. We've had to fight the enemy. We've had to do all these things. We've nationalized industry. We've had forced labor for civilians in the militaries, price controls, hyperinflation. This has caused depopulation, famine, a decline in living standards. It's not my fault. I never wanted to have to do this. The war situation made it happen. In 1921, he introduces the new economic policy. Basically, new economic policy was a retreat to a market-oriented approach, right? A return to capitalism. It ends in 1924 when Lenin dies. It worked. Why? Because it wasn't socialism, communism, Leninism, Marxism, Bolshevism, whatever name you want to give it, right? It's a return to a market economy. The prices could work out. The peasants could negotiate. It was rough for a while. But, if Lenin somehow left the picture, if the new economic policy could have continued, maybe things would have turned out differently. But if you're going to measure Lenin's revolution, let's be honest, let's call it a coup, by the promises of peace, bread, and land, then really it wasn't successful in the long run.
Jonathan, can you say something about the 1918 Red Terror and how this framed successive Soviet governments? Did this have a long-term impact on communist administration?
Lenin, as I talked about before, really had no respect for no love for his own people. He also had no qualms about using, in his own words, merciless mass terror to inflict pain, punishment on the Russian people. He even called out for a merciless smashing of counter-revolutionary activity. Remember, this is not just Lenin. Marx himself said that people must perish to make room for people who are fit for a new world. Right? So it's not that Lenin perverted this. Marx was calling for much the same thing.
Social Darwinism.
Forced social Darwinism, where they decide who lives and who dies, right?
Yes.
That sort of, not any sort of natural forces whatsoever. A secret police had existed in Russia really since the time of Ivan the Terrible in the 1600s. It exists now under the the Russian letters Cheka, the Extraordinary Commission under the Pole Felix Dzerzhinsky. It was founded in December 1970, right, just a month after Lenin took over. So there are, again, revisionist historians who like to claim that the Red Terror was something that Lenin never really wanted, right? The revolution was in danger, and unless we shot a few people, it was going to fall apart.
And now we'll take a short break from our discussion on the 100th anniversary of the Russian Revolution. You're listening to Strategikon, the podcast of SIA. And that was the 1987 late Soviet-era rock song Revolution by band DDT, featuring lead singer Yuri Shevchuk. And for those of you who would like to find out what the song is about, please check out our show notes. Jonathan has provided an approximate translation. And now we'll return to our discussion on the legacy of the Russian Revolution 100 years on.
The evidence after the fact shows, it was a carefully thought out plan by Lenin, handwritten in a series of memos, which he sent out to people, including Dzerzhinsky, ordering meetings, calling meetings, ordering a discussion of this, ultimately assigning the job, to the secret police, to the Cheka. The Cheka was sort of the early 20th century predecessor of the KGB, which today is known as the FSB. After the fact, Lenin and Dzerzhinsky both claimed that the Red Terror saved the revolution. This is not correct, right? The Tsar was never coming back no matter. All it did was basically save Lenin, Dzerzhinsky, and the Bolshevik Party. Had they not had it, had Lenin failed, you would have had some type of constituent assembly. You probably would have had some sort of, semi-socialist, squishy socialist Russia for a while that would have sort of worked itself out with, the rest of Europe. But who was rounded up? Tsarists, liberals, broadly defined, non-Bolshevik socialists, meaning actually the majority of socialists, right? The majority of the left-wing politicians. And this is a broad spectrum. It's not all the extreme of the Bolsheviks. You'd have, the Mensheviks, the people who basically didn't want czars, and the people who had faith in the Russian people. If you weren't a Bolshevik, basically, you could get rounded up. Of course, as we know under Stalin, even being a Bolshevik wouldn't necessarily save you. Members of the clergy, remember, this is an atheist state that's come about, so members of the clergy. The kulaks. Kulaks are rich peasants. It seems an anomaly to call peasants rich, but these are the peasants who were successful. These are the peasants who really knew how to run their farms, who understood things such as crop rotation, right? Things that when you start mandatorily collectivizing farms, all get lost in the collective consciousness, right? The fact that the peasants left alone would have been able to feed Russia in a way that the state under collective farming, introduced mass famine tells an awful lot about, the failures of, most Marxist, Leninist so-called science. The guess is that there were at least 8,500 executions in just the first year, far more people than ever died under Nicholas or probably any other single czar. Nearly 100,000 arrested, many sent to prison camps. Some believe that by the time it was over, there were over 100,000 executed. it's important to know, right, this is not something that started under Stalin, right? There again, historians who like to say Lenin was a purist, Lenin was a revolutionary, Lenin was savior, Lenin was whatever. Stalin was an aberration, Stalin was evil. This all started under Lenin. If you read, there's a series of books called the Matrokin Archive. Vasily Matrokin was the KGB librarian, sort of around the time of Perestroika, right? The classic disgruntled employee, wasn't getting raises, had a dacha, I believe it was in what would become modern-day Latvia. So again, it was all the Soviet Union at that point. He was the sole person charged with taking some of the more sensitive documents from the old location to the new location. Some of this he did on the weekends by way of his dacha, where he carefully hand-copied certain documents and photographed certain documents. Then at one point he approached the U.S. Embassy, and they thought that he was a false flag. He went to the British. The British were more trusting. And if you know the famed British military historian Christopher Andrew and Matrokin together wrote 2 series of books where they basically put a lot of these KGB archives in print form, and one of which are copies of things that show Lenin signing orders for the execution of the Romanovs, Lenin signing orders for the restarting up of the Tsarist prison camps, which became the gulags, right? That all this really was Lenin.
So can I say that Stalin, therefore, was actually a very good understudy to Lenin?
Yes, I mean, Stalin learned a lot of the things on his own as well, right? He learned a lot of things from his youth. Stalin became a revolutionary because his brother was a revolutionary. His brother ended up being executed. So Stalin had his own reason for killing people. But let's just say that the change from Lenin to Stalin was not an aberration. It was really sort of a logical conclusion or a logical continuation of what Lenin did, but on a much, much larger scale.
Moving on to the legacy of the Russian Revolution, Jonathan, what would you say were its key milestones politically and socially?
It's interesting because when you have a country like the Soviet Union that writes history based on what they want history to say rather than the facts, really the death or removal of every communist leader is a milestone of its own because you have a brand new history coming out afterwards, right? Stalin rewrote history to include himself at Lenin's side. Khrushchev didn't so much as rewrite history, but expose the true history of Stalinism. Brezhnev tried to clamp things down again. By the time Andropov, Chernenko, Gorbachev came around, right, things were opening up. There's a Gorbachev-era joke about students taking a history exam and worrying that the correct answers will change from the time when they finish the exam until it's graded, right? In other words, that things were being changed so rapidly. Now, let's talk about some of the things that the Bolsheviks claimed were successes, right? They claimed universal literacy, women's suffrage, full equality for all ethnic groups and social classes, and to some extent, again, all of these were true. The question is, how did it really play out, right? If the Politburo, the ruling group, should be representative of the people, you think that there should be a wide variety of ethnicities, men and women serving on it. In reality, they were almost all Russians. Usually there was one token ethnic minority, right? Somebody usually from one of the current Central Asian countries. One woman. There was never any danger that they were actually going to be in control, right? They were there to show that, we have these representative bodies here, right? Except for Stalin, who was Georgian. Khrushchev was Ukrainian, but his power base was really Moscow, right? Everyone who ruled the Politburo, everyone who served as general secretary was a Russian. So it was really a very, top-down, maybe we're all equal, but Russians are more equal than everybody else type of nation. Other ethnicities over time were Russified, right? If you look at, it's still true in parts of the Baltics, although they would prefer it not be. It's certainly true in the 5 Stan republics. It's true in the Caucasus republics, right? Russia is basically a lingua franca. Why? Because they weren't allowed to use Kazakh, Kyrgyz for large matters. These were not taught. They were all taught to be Russian. That's why these countries today are really struggling, to define their own national identity because they've been taken from them during these 70 years. So there was really no equality of ethnicities except for the fact that we should all be equally Russian even if we're not. Social classes, well, remember, Russia had no social classes. Everyone was equal. As Churchill said, I believe it was the equal sharing of miseries. Keep in mind, right, there were special stores for the Communist Party hierarchy. Not everybody lived in communal apartments where, you live according to allotted space, sharing bathrooms and kitchens. These places were hell in which to live. If it was equal, then everybody would have lived in the same place, or everybody would have had nice places. There is very clearly a hierarchy. Everybody knew it. Depending on who was the leader, what period in history it was, you could speak more or less openly about it. You wouldn't speak about it under Stalinism, under Khrushchev, under Gorbachev. You certainly could, right? Again, as we talked about, also there was no desire to get large swaths of people into the party. Women were certainly liberated. There was, universal suffrage for women. Of course, there was nobody to actually vote for. But women's liberation in Russia really meant not that you had the right to work and vote, but that you had to work, right? So, working became mandatory for everyone. So women had to go to a workplace, whether they wanted to or not. They also had to run the households out of necessity, right? As the Soviet Union developed further and further, more and more Russian men drank more, smoked more, were in poor health, simply wouldn't do much around the home. So, sort of the, feminism at the end of the Soviet Union really meant not having to do all these things that women in the West fought for the right to be able to do. And today, interestingly enough, it's a sign of success to be able to make enough that your wife doesn't have to work. Literacy was achieved, but of course the materials that were used promoted literacy only in Russian, and they were heavy with propaganda, right? I don't know what books you grew up with. We grew up with, Dick and Jane, Sid the Snake, little readers like this. There it was baby Lenin, baby Trotsky for a while till Stalin writes him out of history. Okay? So basically you see, over and over again, what they're doing is they're basically destroying the basic Russian social fabric, right? They get rid of religion, rather than let, things clearly in the West change over time. Some because people man the barricades, some because sympathetic people get into parliament and vote. But, it's a process. It doesn't happen overnight. And when it's a process, it's much more widely accepted. It's easier for people to work with, to deal with. Basically the Bolsheviks came and tore up this mass social fabric and didn't leave much in its place. They created a new religion around themselves, sort of the religion of Leninism. But, it was as hollow as some of those statues of Lenin are hollow.
Could you say that, at least from a, dare I say, and really there's a lot of negative surrounding this as well, but from a more positive perspective, the Russian Revolution sort of turbocharged the Russian technological base. By 1957, Russia, had the Sputnik in orbit. It had these wins, these significant wins during the Cold War in particular, but they were also so very far behind the West technologically speaking. But, when you think of where Russia was in 1917 to where it became in, say, 1960, I mean, you're talking about two different planets, aren't you?
You are basically in the same way that when Peter the Great came to the throne, right? There was a mini-series starring Peter the Great when I think I was back in high school. Peter standing on the cliffs of the Neva River, basically screaming, "I'm going to drag Russia kicking and screaming into the modern world," right? The question is, and again, here we can play with history a little bit. Yes, the Soviet Union turned around in about 50 years. If the Soviet Union hadn't existed and there then hadn't been World War II, would any of this would have happened? How much of this was precipitated the same way a lot of changes were in the United States, because you suddenly had to figure out how to do a lot of stuff because of World War II. And remember, a lot of the rocketry was done because we split the German rocket officials after World War II.
Correct.
It's true they did all that. That's 50 years away from Lenin. You also have to remember at the time that scientists who were being arrested were basically being kept under lab arrest, right? Scientists weren't necessarily being taken off to the gulags under Stalin and shot. They were basically locked away in labs, and you have a lot of incentive to come up with things very clearly. If something being a failure, ends up in your death, right? Think of how many North Korean engineers have probably been executed because a rocket blows up on the launching pad.
Yep.
I think you can do a lot out of fear. You can do a lot because you have to out of war. What would have been the result if Russia had developed naturally? Maybe they wouldn't have been at the first of all those things, but would it have come at as high of a cost?
Jonathan, is the current political order under Vladimir Putin, as bad as it might well appear to outsiders, still better than previous Soviet rule?
Russia is still very much an authoritarian state, right? Authoritarian state basically try to keep everybody cowed. This is what Putin's trying to do. But let's also be fair to Putin in comparison, with the Leninist, Stalinist times, right? There's no mass murder under Putin like there is under Lenin and Stalin. There are targeted killings, right? Galina Starovoitova, who defended ethnic minorities. Anna Politkovskaya reported on the Chechen Wars. Boris Nemtsov, an opposition politician who uncovered things about Putin's corruption. Alexander Litvinenko, the former spy. Be careful about where you eat sushi in London. Sergei Magnitsky, after whom the Magnitsky Act is named. Again, this isn't like Stalin where you just feel the need to kill 10 million people, someday a million people. For Putin, this is personal. I'm not in any way trying to justify this, but Putin is going after targeted enemies. For Stalin, for Lenin, everybody was an enemy. There's no mass incarceration, right? To some extent, the vast majority of criminals arrested in Putin's Russia are probably actual criminals of some sort. There are targeted incarcerations, of course, that are absurd, right? Mikhail Khodorkovsky, allegedly for tax problems. I think somebody who looked at the Russian tax law at the time that he was accused of violating noted even if he had wanted to pay taxes, there's really no mechanism in Russia for paying taxes. The band Pussy Riot for committing so-called acts of sacrilege in Moscow's Cathedral of Christ the Savior, right? You do something like that in the West, you probably get community service, get yelled at, and you probably sell twice as many, albums the next time you release something because of the publicity, right? Alexei Navalny for speaking up, for daring to run against Putin, for authoring, publishing reports about Putin and Medvedev. Again, this isn't, mass incarceration of everyone. These, again, are targeted people who, Putin, doesn't like. Masha Gessen warned in an editorial actually shortly after the Trump election, trying to compare what she worried about for Trump's America, with Putin's Russia, is that, institutions don't protect us. Institutions won't protect the Russian people. Somebody like Khodorkovsky, Navalny gets dragged up before, a Russian court. The verdict's been predetermined.
I was just thinking, Jonathan, if I was a historical not revisionist, but a
historian.
A revisionist historian. A relativist historian. I would sit back and I would say, well, okay, if the Soviet Union was a historic aberration and arrested Russian natural political development and social development, would Putin be considered the start of this kind of natural Russian development? I mean, after all said and done, I don't believe for a moment that Russia would have been a liberal democracy had the Bolsheviks lost and the Mensheviks have taken over. I mean, I think it would have still been some sort of autocratic state, maybe something along the lines of a Vladimir Putin as opposed to a Joseph Stalin. So are we seeing now Russia recalibrate itself into a more natural space politically for itself?
I mean, that's a good question. I think it would have depended largely upon, at least initially, who maintained power. If Kerensky had maintained power, he was not the strongest leader. He might have dithered around. It might have turned out differently than if somebody else rather strong had come in and laid down the law. On the other hand, if you had an elected constituent assembly, and then you had a second election where people stepped down peacefully, then it might not be the type of democracy we would like. But I think it would have been more democratic than you have under Putin, where you see ballot watchers filling out ballots for people, stuffing the ballot box, and then claiming that they're allowed to do that under law.
Right.
It's look in the modern Georgian state, right? Saakashvili came to power with a revolution. Nobody knew how he was going to leave, and when he lost an election, he simply packed up and went home, and this shocked people. Right? The same thing has happened in Kyrgyzstan. So, I mean, there is some precedent in this post-Soviet space for it actually working. We don't know about how it's going to work in Russia because the one time Putin stepped down, he handed the reins of power over to Medvedev, who promptly appointed him prime minister and let him make all the decisions. So I think the real test is going to be, what happens when Putin leaves? Are they allowed to choose a real leader? Doubtful.
You don't think that Putin's got some sort of protege being quietly trained in the background, do you?
There's always rumors that, somebody else is next on his list to take over. I think the current defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, is on that list. I'm not sure if Medvedev is still on that list or not. But remember, when you have everyone who's the same age, And this is the problem you have right now in the Chinese Politburo, right? In other words, they don't have a designated successor. When you have everyone who's the same age, you really have a power vacuum. You're not training that younger generation. Putin has other problems as well, right? There's so much financial corruption. He's grabbing so much money up for himself, right? If he hadn't been so corrupt, estimates are every individual Russian would have been, much more comfortable. We don't have exit visas now like you did in Soviet times. Anyone's free to leave the country, but Putin has actually encouraged people, if you don't like it here, just leave, go home. And, this brain drain is not going to help either. Back in 1922, Lenin kicked a lot of people out of the country who didn't want to be there, smart people. That was a mistake the Soviets didn't make again because they suddenly go to another country. What's going to happen? What would happen if Lenin weren't there and those people had stayed? Would Russia have developed faster, better, simply by having that intellectual class there? Yep. What's going to happen to Russia? And I have some friends who have worked over there, with Russian spouses, Russian friends, who were always in the back of their heads thinking, if we can't fly this person directly to the U.S., then we can go on vacation in Vietnam and then just leave. In other words, starting to think in the back of their minds, at some point, Putin's going to realize this isn't maybe a good idea, and then some people are not going to be able to leave.
How has Putin cashed in on the mythology of the Russian Revolution to shore up his legitimacy in the eyes of Russian people? Does Putin represent continuity or discontinuity with the legacy of the Russian Revolution?
I think that if you look at Russia today, the revolution is all but being ignored, right? Putin is, there are no grand celebrations of the Russian Revolution. The only people who are celebrating is the Communist Party. Gennady Zyuganov made a statement today about celebrating it. But take a look at these communists. As one of my colleagues said about 20 years ago, when Zyuganov was incidentally still the head of the Communist Party, they look about 20 pounds heavier and are wearing better suits than they did. Even they knew that it never really worked. Putin, people have compared Putin a little bit to Nikita Khrushchev. Nikita Khrushchev was anti-Stalinist but never stopped being a communist. Putin is still, in some ways, very like a Stalinist, right? The very rigid authoritarianism, but he's not a communist, he's not a revolutionary, right? I would say, the cover of, The Economist for about a week ago gets it right? Putin sees himself in the role of a czar. I think it would now be Tsar Vladimir III. The first two were Vladimir the Great, so maybe he has some hope for himself there. And as a czar, and considering what happened, to the Romanovs, he hates revolutions, right? What's happened in the world around him, right? You've had color revolutions in Ukraine, in Kyrgyzstan, in Georgia. You had an Arab Spring. You had an attempted military coup in Turkey, or whatever it was that actually happened, right? Somebody like Putin, who's surrounded by a small cabal that keeps him in power, does not like the idea of a revolution, especially a revolution that did not come from the masses but came from a small cabal who put somebody new in power. I would say that, Putin sees himself much more as trying to find continuity with the Russian Empire, really wishing that this 70 years had somehow not happened, not realizing, of course, he's a product of it. This is odd because, Putin on one hand says the fall of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. At the same time, he's blaming Lenin for all of its faults. Stalin doesn't get blamed, but of course the implication is with no Lenin, there's nothing else either. Some people have seen him as an Ivan III, Ivan the Great, the Prince of Muscovy, who started gathering the Russian lands together as he threatens to collect the Baltics, as he threatens to collect northern Kazakhstan, as he's collected parts of Ukraine. There's a statue of Vladimir I the Great, the person who brought Christianity to Kiev and Rus. Note where it happened, in Ukraine, not in Russia. This isn't a statue that he had, say, delivered to Kiev. Instead, he plopped it right outside the Kremlin walls. The Ukrainian government's not terribly happy about this, right? There are two new statues to Ivan the Terrible, who founded the Russian police state, the first Russian secret police, the Oprichniki, right? Now, there are some Soviet-era statues as well. A statue to Kalashnikov holding his rifle showed up recently in Moscow as well. Meanwhile, statues of Lenin and the communists have come down. Many of the imperial statues, for all the things the communists had to say about the Russian Empire, most of them stayed upright. Nobody's removed the bronze horsemen. Statues of the Alexanders, the Nicholases, they were there when I was studying there in 1988, right? They never came down. Lenin's disappeared, right? So I don't think he really represents continuity with the Russian Revolution. He's trying to establish continuity with the Russian Empire.
So, Jonathan, why does the Russian Revolution matter?
I mean, in very basics, it matters as a destructive lesson in history, right? Why do we teach the Holocaust? Right? We teach the Holocaust so we can identify when this is going to happen, when the chances of this happening are there, in the hopes that it won't happen again. Right-wing politicians, even today, are properly called out and vilified if they really espouse, far right-wing, Nazi ideas. Former President Reagan, before he was president, showed up on Meet the Press and said, he was coming, to introduce himself because, quote, people hear you're conservative and they think you eat babies, right? There's this idea that everyone on the right is evil, everyone on the left is good, right? What's the example? Where does this lead us to, right? Right-wing politicians are often, improperly called Nazis or fascists, right? We sort of use this blanket term. As I think Daniel Hannan noted, if everybody's a Nazi, then nobody's a Nazi, right? So if we teach, these far extreme right-wing politics, we should do it as a lesson so it doesn't happen again. So when we truly see it, we can identify it, call it out, and try to stop it. At the same time, this never happens on the left, right? Marxism, Leninism, Marx and Lenin are taught as serious subjects in academia. No one teaches or would think that teaching about fascism in the same way is actually correct, right? Let's look at a survey, a recent survey among millennials, right? Would ask, who's a personal hero for you, a hero for your country, a hero for the world, right? Marx gets 18%, Lenin 17%, Mao 16%. Stalin 13%, Nicolas Maduro gets 12%. Yeah. Now, some of these people you could say, it's just youthful dabbling. You're giving an answer that's going to anger your parents. But I think it was closer to 25% have a positive view of somebody like Marx, even if they don't regard him as a hero. How would people react if this survey had Hitler or Mussolini even showing up on the answers? Right? It should be concerning that that considering all the numbers of people, and estimates go up, close to 100 million that died because of the philosophies of Marxism, Leninism, that, that this isn't being called out. This isn't being called out for what it is. Now, let's say there is some hope on this survey. Justin Trudeau gets 38%, Angela Merkel 37%. So some sane people rise to the top there. Let's look at the UK too, right? Who's leading the Labour Party in the UK? You have Jeremy Corbyn, who is an unabashed, Marxist, Leninist socialist, who has had nothing but great things to say about Hugo Chavez and Hugo Chavez's Venezuela, where they're basically living off whatever they can find on the streets one day, right? If somebody like Bernie Sanders wins here, not a whole lot's going to change. If he had won the presidency, there probably still would have been a Republican Congress. If he had won Congress, there'd be a correction election in 2 years. Not a whole lot of damage would or could be done. Corbyn could come in and destroy a lot of the UK social fabric, history, place in the world. We know this based on what he said in his own words, right? Lenin never made a secret of what he wanted to do. What might look good on paper, but has really always been against human nature, it's always turned out badly, right? And all you have to do is look at the bodies, right? I was at a talk once, one of these revisionist historians was basically asked, how do you explain all the bodies, in the Holodomor in Ukraine, right? The millions of people who were starved. The answer was, quote, they were just nationalists. In other words, sort of implying that, they weren't along with the Soviet path. They wanted a free, independent, national Ukraine. They had to go, right? Very much along what Marx or Lenin would say, right? This is not the lesson that people should be getting out of this, right? The lesson should be, there are good revolutions in the world, right? The American one turned out pretty damn well, I might say so myself. The French one had a few rough days there. Some heads were lost, but all in all turned out better. The Russian Revolution caused the deaths of tens of millions of people. Instigated revolutions in places like China, Vietnam, Cambodia, Cuba. Is still ongoing in places like Venezuela and North Korea. Without the Russian Revolution, it's unlikely these places would have happened. But how do you keep justifying or explaining or taking seriously this movement when the result every single time has been millions of dead bodies?
If I can go back to something that you mentioned earlier, and that was that Lenin was a very good propagandist. He was a terrible leader, but he really understood the power of language and how to hit with words. I suppose the one thing that one could say is that that is the legacy of Lenin, and arguably it's the legacy of the Russian Revolution that echoes down through the ages, where those people who speak in favor of Marxism, Leninism, they have that ability to articulate a mythology of that ideology in the world that prevents them from really having the heat of history put on them.
It really seems to be like that, because if somebody were to stand up in say the exact same type of thing about any of the right-wing movements, they would be the first people to stand up and denounce them properly.
Yeah.
But if it goes the other way, they find a way to brush it off, or sometimes just change the subject, or, the common retort that it's hard, I don't know how you come back to this, say, well, it was never really, real communism, real socialism, real Marxism, real Leninism. Anyway, where somebody were to come back and say, well, maybe it wasn't real fascism, again, they would be rightly appalled by that statement.
Yeah. Look, ending on a counterfactual note, what if the Russian Revolution never happened?
I mean, that's an interesting game to play. There have been a few articles just in the last couple of days, written about that. Had it never happened, there would have been a lot more people, I think, alive in Russia, in China, in other countries, that weren't. An argument can be made there, Hitler might not have risen to power if you believe that the German right came to power as a reaction against the Soviet left, the claims that only they could do it. Possibly Hitler would have never come to power. If that is true, then there probably would not have been a World War II. Right? This is not to say it would have been a peaceful century. Right? There are always power vacuums that people fight against. There still very well could have been a World War II in the Pacific. Right? The U.S. and Japan still could have come to blows. I think probably there would have been some sort of quasi-socialistic, but at least at first democratically elected government in Russia. How it would have developed over time is anyone's guess. Could the monarchy have been brought back in some type of British form or other European form, where they're great for bringing in tourist dollars, but they really don't do a whole lot as sort of a unifying structure. Right? What happened after Franco died? And some Francoists tried to stage a coup. Who was it who brought who appeared on TV and tried to calm everyone down? Right? That was King Juan Carlos. What if in all the chaos of a post-non-Bolshevik revolutionary Russia, there was some czar with no power but the gravitas to say, hey guys, calm down, I'm still here as this unifying factor? That might have changed some of history. You probably would not have had a communist China, right? You would have had a Chiang Kai-shek probably running a nationalist China instead. Who knows what that would have meant for a Hong Kong, a Taiwan, a Macau. I mean, it's simple to say basically all of 20th century history would have been rewritten. Exactly what would have turned out, we don't know. There still would have been probably somebody who had shown up, caused trouble in the world. But, if somebody like Mussolini rose to power in Italy without a Hitler behind him, he probably would have faded just as quickly.
Well, Jonathan, that brings this episode to a close. Thanks for being with us today, and we'll look forward to hearing from you again soon.
Well, thank you.
This is Strategikon. I'm John Bruni, and that's the show for now. You can subscribe and download Strategikon through iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, and TuneIn, as well as from sageinternational.org.au. If you want to know more about Sage International Australia, check out our pages on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and our website sageinternational.org.au. Until next time, goodbye.